We start today in San Francisco, where plenty of bars and restaurants are now asking customers to show proof of vaccination. NBC News correspondent Jake Ward is there.
Allison, that's right. You know, if you think about it, right, nobody knows human behavior better than a bartender. And if that is true, well, this city, it turns out, is full of people who understand human behavior. This is a city of less than 1 million people, and yet it has about 3,000 bars inside the city limits. That makes it one of the most densely populated bar cities in the country. Now, a coalition of about 300 bars, about 500 owners, have decided to impose their own rules. They're going to make it such that you cannot go into a bar to have a drink unless you can either show a vaccine card or a negative test result. Otherwise, you have to sit in one of these parklets outside to enjoy your drink. Now, bar owners say that so far the pushback has been very minimal. A little bit of whining at the door, but nobody causing a scene. The only places that people seem to be strenuously objecting is on social media, as is often the case. Now, we spoke to the head of the Bar Owners Alliance to find out how exactly they made this decision, and here's how he described it.
Don't mistake a bar that survived the pandemic with a healthy business. I mean, most of us took on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt just to stay alive, just to have these businesses continue on. And it's been really hard. The thing I will say is that for the first 12 months, we were against a virus. And of course, human behavior was good and bad, but really there was no solution. We couldn't control it as we needed to. But the problem now is that we actually can control it.
Now, Allison, this is, of course, all happening against the backdrop of very desperate times for bar and restaurant owners. We're talking about an industry that suffered something like $200 billion or more in losses over the course of the pandemic. You know, we're talking about an industry that has lost about 90,000 bars and restaurants to either permanently closing or closing for an undetermined period of time. And most importantly here, Allison, we're talking about an industry that lost 1.4 million employees, people that would not work in a place like this, walked away from these kinds of jobs. And as a result, bar owners here say they can't afford to have someone leave because they have to be quarantined. They need to protect their coworkers in addition to their customers. Meanwhile, San Francisco, of course, is imposing a new mask mandate now that it's seen its 7-day positivity rate go from 0.5% just a month ago to about 5.5% now. All of that means that we're facing not just a test of business, not just a test of human behavior, but a real test of how we're all going to function in what looks like the next wave of this pandemic. Allison?
Unvaccinated pregnant women are filling hospital beds in COVID units across the country. Now some of the world's largest obstetrician groups are encouraging expecting mothers to roll up their sleeves. NBC News correspondent Kristen Dahlgren has more.
At hospitals across the country, the Delta variant fueling a surge in pregnant patients.
This is just a game changer for us.
Texas Dr. Jessica Eric has seen more hospitalized pregnant COVID patients in the past 3 weeks than the entire pandemic combined, all of them unvaccinated.
I told my husband, I was laying in bed, I feel like I'm drowning. Like I cannot breathe.
In Indiana, Savannah Moore was 33 weeks pregnant when she was admitted to the hospital with COVID. At one point, her heart stopped. She was on a ventilator and sedated. 10 days later, she woke up to find out they had delivered her daughter 7 weeks premature.
All I could do was cry, saying, I'm putting my baby in harm's way because I was just too hard-headed not to get the vaccine.
For months, there have been mixed messages about the vaccine for pregnant women. While the CDC said it appears safe, they stopped short of encouraging it. But in the past week, the world's largest obstetrician groups began recommending COVID vaccines for all pregnant women. 140,000 pregnant women have already gotten the vaccine. And while safety studies are ongoing, preliminary research has been positive.
We saw no increased risk of stillbirth, no increased risk of preterm birth, no increased risk of growth problems with baby.
Pfizer and Moderna continue to study the impact on pregnant women, but tonight leading doctors say the risks from the Delta variant are much more concerning.
Good morning, beautiful.
Moore is now home with a healthy baby named Delaney.
I would not wish what I went through on my worst enemy.
Knowing how close she came to losing everything.
Kristen joins me live now. Kristen, this has been a really tough call for pregnant women because they were not included in the studies for emergency use authorization of these shots. The CDC didn't go so far as to recommend them. So let's just go over what the American College of Obstetricians and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine are now saying about COVID shots for pregnant women. What is their advice?
Right. So originally, because they didn't have the data from the clinical trials on pregnant women, they did say they were safe, but they were saying that they shouldn't be withheld from pregnant women. Now they're actively saying that all pregnant women should get them, and that pregnant women should feel confident that these vaccines are safe and that it not only protects them, but also their families and their communities. They cite a growing body of research. We now have that 140,000 women, pregnant women, who have gotten this vaccine. They've looked at many of them. And so looking at that data, they are telling pregnant women that it's safe. They're telling doctors to encourage their patients to get them, but they're also saying that doctors do need to keep in mind that this is a difficult decision for women, and also think about some of the historic injustices and systemic racism that goes into some women making this decision. So they want doctors to be sensitive to that, but they are saying that this is something they should be doing to protect themselves and to protect their unborn children. Allison.
Kristen, what else have you heard from expecting moms about their COVID concerns, whether it's fear of the Delta variant or the vaccine itself? I know anecdotally, even just in our own family, we have some moms-to-be, and they were even just nervous about when in their pregnancy they should get the vaccine.
Yeah, and I know from being pregnant, I mean, it's a really difficult decision even when you're deciding whether or not to take an aspirin. I mean, knowing that what you do is impacting the baby, and the baby really is getting anything that you take as well. And so they do have these fears. And I think not being included in clinical trials, which, by the way, is pretty routine that they don't include pregnant women in trials for anything. It's not just for the COVID vaccine. And now they are continuing to study based on the women that have gotten it, and the drug companies are continuing to study. There's also a concern about which vaccine, if I decide to get it, which do I get? And so these obstetrician groups aren't recommending which vaccine to get, but they do want doctors to point out that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine does have that very rare risk of blood clots, something that women that are pregnant are already predisposed to possibly get. And so that's something that they do want them to be aware of. So a lot of things for women to consider, but based on the data, doctors saying it is safe and it's important. And here's something too, is that they're now seeing that the antibodies that a woman gets if she gets the vaccine while she's pregnant are found in cord blood. That means that those antibodies are getting to the baby. And so that baby, who could be so vulnerable to COVID-19, is also a little bit protected when it's born, because it is going to be some time before children born now can get the vaccine. So there's evidence that it's building up some protection in that newborn.
Oh, great to hear. Kristen, thanks so much for your reporting today. So important for so many new moms, moms-to-be, all the women out there. Thank you. We really appreciate it. All right, let's bring in infectious disease physician and St. Louis Board of Health member, Dr. Matthew Schladishweyo-Davis. Dr. Davis, great to have you here. Kristen Zogin reporting there on the push to get more pregnant women vaccinated. Two major OBGYN associations are now recommending all pregnant women get vaccinated. What should expecting mothers know about the risks and the rewards of the COVID vaccine?
Well, expecting mothers should know that this is absolutely the right move. So far, studies equivocally worldwide have shown that preliminary data says that these are safe. They are effective. Is it unfortunate that we are on a time crunch? Yes, we're in a pandemic. And so what I would advise pregnant women to do is to weigh the risks of getting a vaccine, this vaccine, versus the risks of getting COVID. And what we've seen is, especially with Delta in play, that the number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are way up right now. My husband, to share with you, is actually a pediatric hospitalist in the NICU. He comes home after a night shift just haggard because of babies that are born prematurely, because of mothers that are overwhelmed by COVID. This cannot happen. The risks of getting COVID way outnumber the benefits, way outnumber the risks of getting the vaccine. And so this is the right call for pregnant moms.
Okay, bottom line, pregnant moms, you say get the vaccine.
Yeah.
Let's talk about New York City requiring proof of vaccination for indoor activities, things like dining, concerts, gyms. This is the first big U.S. city to do so. Here's what Mayor Bill de Blasio said when he announced those new mandates today.
This is a miraculous place, literally full of wonders. And if you're vaccinated, all that's going to open up to you. You'll have the key. You can open the door. But if you're unvaccinated, unfortunately, you will not be able to participate in many things. That's the point we're trying to get across. It's time for people to see vaccination as literally necessary to living a good and full and healthy life.
All right, so I have to agree with the mayor. I'm a New Yorker. It is a miraculous place full of wonders. But it's not just New York, right? In San Francisco, another amazing city. Some bars and restaurants are saying you need to be vaccinated or you need to have a negative COVID test if you want to come in. Dr. Davis, your take on these plans. Do you think more cities across the country should be doing things like this?
Listen, Allison, I like to stay in my lane. I'm a healthcare provider, and that's what I do best. But what I will say is this. I empathize with small businesses. They've been put in an impossible situation. Yeah. They've been asked to keep the people at their doors safe, but they haven't been provided with a means to do so. So now these mandates are necessary. We shouldn't be in this place. I agree. I'm as exhausted, frustrated, and completely wiped out as the next person, especially that much more taking care of folks that are, coming into our hospitals with COVID. But we are here, and this will continue to get worse if we don't get on top of it. At the end of the day, vaccinations need to happen so we can reach herd immunity. So is this highly uncomfortable? Have I heard the outcry? Do people feel like their freedoms are being threatened? I hear that. But what I see that most people don't see is what actually happens when you get COVID. Being put on a ventilator, not being able to come off of it in some cases is horrific. Families are being torn apart. It's devastating. And so I feel like this is the right move, especially in jurisdictions and in states that have higher case positivity rates. And if we all buckle down, we don't have to be here for long.
All right, let's talk about the COVID situation in our country, because for people who may think, well, things are open again, we're past the worst of it, that is certainly not the case. The COVID infection rate in the U.S. is trending up. It's averaging nearly 75,000 new cases a day right now. That is higher than last summer's peak before we even had a vaccine. What does that tell you about where we are, Dr. Davis? And what is that forecast for the fall and winter ahead if we don't do something about this?
It's grim, Allison, and you've had me on this show long enough to know that I'm usually a bright, sparky, hopeful person, but it's grim. And it's grim for 2 reasons. I try to be, but it's a tough time to be that right now as a healthcare provider. It really is. And it's for 2 reasons. The first is that not enough people are vaccinated, so people are at risk. Over 98% of new cases are in unvaccinated folks. Over 99% of hospitalizations and deaths in unvaccinated folks. It's very clear. And then on top of that, you've got the Delta variant in play. We know this is 50% more transmissible. We know it accounts for more new cases. So it's even more urgent that people get vaccinated. If we don't before this winter season, we are in a whole lot of trouble, more so than what we saw last year. Because with flu comes indoors, comes a whole host of other respiratory viruses, and that means overwhelmed hospitals, running out of ventilators again, a place we don't need to be. There are countries around the world who buckle down for a finite period of time and have been able to enjoy certain freedoms. Sure, Delta has undone some of that for them, but there are better places. We can get there. We have everything here. So I really encourage folks out there to be thoughtful about their loved ones and their communities. The vaccination is the right step. I know it's scary for a lot of people. I know uncertainty makes people worried, but there is absolutely no question that it's the right move in the face of something like COVID that can really, really be destructive.
Yeah, this is certainly not going to get better as it gets colder outside, as the flu kicks in and we all take to the indoors to get out from that cold and are closer to one another. Dr. Davis, even when you're presenting some grim news, you always have a good outlook. We appreciate that about you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Allison. You're wonderful. Talk soon.
Talk to you soon. COVID restrictions are coming back, and so too is the debate over religious freedom. The Supreme Court rejecting requests from a church in Maine to block the state from reimposing new restrictions. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams joins me now from Washington, D.C. So, Pete, this one's a little bit interesting. Maine's Governor Janet Mills lifted COVID restrictions on indoor gatherings back in May, hasn't brought them back yet, but the church asked the Supreme Court to take this up anyway. How come?
Because they said they might come back. This is Calvary Chapel of Bangor, Maine. They said the rules imposed by the Governor Janet Mills were the most severe restrictions in the nation on places of worship, that they began with a ban on gatherings for religious worship. They were later modified to let 50 worshipers into the church. And it said those limitations violated its religious freedom and made exceptions for other gatherings that were not religious. But the problem for the church is that on May 24th, the governor lifted these capacity limits on all public indoor venues. Even so, the church said the Supreme Court should take this request anyway because it said it feared that the state might reimpose them in response to this Delta variant. But Justice Stephen Breyer rejected the church's motion for an injunction. He didn't have any comment. That's what the court usually does when it doesn't take these cases. But it's quite likely the Supreme Court turned the church down because these restrictions are no longer in effect.
So let me ask then, could this case potentially head back to court if the governor does bring back those restrictions?
Yes, it could. And if the problem for the state is that if the restrictions do single out houses of worship, that could be a problem. The Supreme Court has been sympathetic to claims from churches and synagogues that claim that these COVID restrictions interfere with their religious freedom because they don't affect all public gatherings equally. Now, the advocates of treating churches somewhat differently say, well, church is different because, you know, this is something that is spread by breathing and people are in a closed space. They're singing, they're praying. Sometimes they're very enthusiastic and it's a problem. But the Supreme Court has not been, at least in recent months, very receptive to that claim.
All right, Pete, we will likely see more legal battles like this ahead. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You bet.
Let's go to NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She has the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Hey, Simone.
Hey, Allison. All right, we start in Houston, where the suspect in a deadly road rage incident has turned himself in. Gerald Wayne Williams is accused of fatally shooting a 17-year-old boy after a Houston Astros game a month ago. Williams is charged with murder. And at least 3 people are injured after a workplace shooting near Nashville. Police say a 22-year-old employee opened fire this morning at Smile Direct Club's manufacturing facilities there. He died at the hospital after being shot by police. An investigation into a motive is underway, and Smile Direct Club tells NBC News it is working with police to investigate the shooting. Well, if you happen to be in Lake Tahoe this week, avoid the chipmunks, please. Parts of that area are closing after those animals tested positive for the plague. Officials say anyone doing outdoor activities in the area should do just that and stay away from them. But the U.S. Forest Service is expecting to have the areas reopened by this weekend. So that's some good news there. All right. The United Arab Emirates plans to lift its ban on transit flights this week. The Gulf state had banned passengers from most South Asian and African countries from traveling through its airports due to the pandemic, but starting Thursday, travelers will be able to make their way through with a negative PCR test 72 hours prior to departure. Final destination approval will still be needed, though. Allison, I'll send it back to you.
The independent investigation has concluded that Governor Andrew Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women and in doing so violated federal and state law.
Governor Andrew Cuomo sexually harassed 11 women, according to the state attorney general's investigation. Cuomo denying the allegations earlier today, saying, "I never touched anyone inappropriately or made inappropriate sexual advances." Let's bring in Susan Del Percio, a former special advisor to Governor Cuomo and an NBC News political analyst, and Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor and an NBC News legal analyst. Glenn, AG Letitia James saying the governor engaged in unwanted groping, kisses, hugging, and made inappropriate comments. Investigators also detailed an exchange with an employee they refer to as Executive Assistant Number 1. Here's a clip.
On November 16th, 2020, in the Executive Mansion, The governor hugged executive assistant number 1 and reached under her blouse to grab her breast. This was the culmination of a pattern of inappropriate sexual conduct, including numerous close and intimate hugs, where the governor held her so closely that her breasts were pressed against his body, and he sometimes ran his hands up and down her back while he did so. There were also several occasions on which the governor grabbed her butt.
Glenn, during his taped response, the governor showed pictures of him touching and kissing people and said he didn't know he was making anyone feel uncomfortable. What do you think of that line of defense and his response today overall?
Allison, that is not a winning defense. You know, people may not realize that in order to assault someone or commit an assault and battery, there doesn't have to be an injury. A battery is actually defined as an offensive touching, and offensive is simply an unconsented to touching. There are now multiple reports, as I've been making my way through the 165-page report that was issued of the investigation. There are multiple reports by as many as 11 women, many of whom talk about an unconsented to touching, an offensive touching. So not only are there possible violations of federal law, but, you know, there could be the kind of evidence that would support a battery charge for what some of these women report Governor Cuomo doing to them. And I have to say, his defense was underwhelming, to say the least.
Yeah, Glenn, I want to ask you more about that because A.G. James wouldn't comment on potential future charges at the presser today, but I understand the Albany County DA is investigating Cuomo, encouraging victims to contact his office. Let's talk about what kind of civil suits we could possibly see here, and then the likelihood you think that perhaps the Albany DA could pursue criminal charges.
Yeah, I did see the Albany County District Attorney tweet out, because I guess that's how we communicate these days, a statement saying that they were requesting the investigative materials from Attorney General Tish James. So that's an ominous sign that they're going to be looking further into what's contained in that report for possible violations of law that the Albany County District Attorney would have jurisdiction over. So the governor could be looking at civil suits being brought by the victims, could be looking at violation of federal civil laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. And there was at least one instance reported of retaliation against somebody who came forward with these allegations against Governor Cuomo. So there could be civil suits, there could be violations of federal civil law, and there could be violations of criminal laws.
Susan, Governor Cuomo apologized to one of his accusers, Charlotte Bennett, but before he did that, he said this. Take a listen.
I have heard Charlotte and her lawyer, and I understand what they are saying. But they read into comments that I made and draw inferences that I never meant. They ascribe motives I never had. And simply put, they heard things that I just didn't say.
Susan, Bennett's lawyer released a statement today saying the governor must resign immediately, along with his senior staff who protected and enabled him in violation of New York state law to the detriment of the women he harassed. If he does not, the New York State Assembly must accept the Attorney General's findings and begin taking the appropriate steps to remove him from office. Susan, this evening, even President Biden said Cuomo should resign. What's your take on Cuomo's political future? Does he have one?
No. But it doesn't stop him from fighting for it. No one does defiance like Andrew Cuomo. He has nowhere to go. The one thing that will probably force him to resign more than anything is I do not think he would want to be impeached. So if those proceedings are moving and you see enough calls for something like that to happen, he may, and I emphasize, may step down. But he is in bunker down mentality. We've seen this before, not quite so bad when he had the Moreland Commission report come out back in 2014. I was there in the office when that came out. And it was clear that they just hunker down for a fight. That's his mentality. He will continue to do so. This time, though, now with the report out, I do not think he will be able to get away with that. Add to the fact that this is a governor who has no political allies, none. He bullies people, he's threatened people over time, and now he will suffer the repercussions of that. I actually think people will go out to him, after him, even more.
Susan, as someone who has been in the room with the governor before, what kinds of conversations are they having right now? What kind of advice would you be giving Governor Cuomo right now? And knowing him as you do, would he take you up on it? Would he listen?
No, he won't listen. He is his own advisor. He thinks he's the smartest person in the room at all times. And sometimes he is, in fact, but not when it comes to himself or managing his own crises. He is probably right now yelling at anyone who's talking out against him and saying what's wrong with them and they hate me because of this. He's taking no personal responsibility, which is clear in his, quote, defense that you showed earlier. He is simply trying to blame the victims. And he creates a very us versus them. He will continue to try and discount and disgrace the Attorney General's office and those who made claims against him.
All right, Susan Del Percio, Glenn Kirshner, thank you both for being with us today.
Thanks, Allison.
Over 100 lawmakers joining Texas Democrats in D.C. to rally for the right to vote. Legislators from 30 states want Congress to put their August recess on hold until they pass a voting rights bill. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson is in Washington, D.C. Priscilla, the Texas Democrats have been in D.C. for just over 3 weeks. They still haven't met with President Biden. What are they saying about that? Are they hopeful they might see the president before they head back home?
Yeah, Allison, it feels like they have met with just about everyone else here in terms of Democrats, except for the president himself. And of course, they are hoping that they will get that meeting in these final days before they're expected to head back to Texas. But in the meantime, what Texas Democrats are saying is they're not bashing the president for not meeting them. Instead, they are emphasizing that they have met with Vice President Kamala Harris twice. They have also met with Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer. And so they are touting those meetings as the progress that they're making. And I spoke with one of these Texas Democratic lawmakers this morning and asked specifically, are you hopeful that that meeting will happen? Here's what she had to say.
I would love for us to meet with the president. I understand the president has a lot on his plate. I know they've been focused on the infrastructure bill, but ultimately what we need right now is to focus on our democracy infrastructure, without which none of the rest is possible. And so this is urgent. We need all eyes on this, all of Congress's efforts on this.
And Allison, I'm told those Texas Democrats could be heading back to the Lone Star State by this weekend. So not a lot of time left for that meeting to take place. Allison?
So, Priscilla, let's talk about what's going on back home. The special legislative session in Texas ending on Friday. What can Texas Republicans do with their voting bill before then? And what happens once the session is over?
Yeah, Texas Republicans can't do anything with that bill without a quorum. We heard from them earlier today in a press conference with both chambers, the House and Senate leadership, with the House members saying, look, the Senate has done their part. They have voted these bills out of their chamber. But because the House doesn't have that quorum, nothing can happen. And so we heard those Republicans again calling on those Texas Democrats to come back in these final days and take votes on that bill and others that have been passed out of the Senate. But of course, Texas Democrats have said that they're not going to do that. And what Republicans said at that presser earlier today is that they think the governor could call them back into session as early as next week. Now, Governor Abbott has not yet commented on a timeline for when they will be back in session, but he has said unequivocally that he will call another special session and that this voting bill and his other priorities will ultimately get a vote. Allison?
Priscilla, Lucy Bain Johnson, the daughter of President Lyndon Johnson, is in D.C. meeting with Texas Democrats. Her father signed the Voting Rights Act back in 1965. What is she saying about the restrictive voting laws that we are seeing cropping up around the country?
Well, she's very concerned about those laws, and it's why she's been in Washington, D.C. this week, meeting with the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and also continuing to encourage those Texas Democrats who remain on the ground here. And her role in all of this is sort of significant. You know, she was in the room when her father, LBJ, signed the Voting Rights Act. She was 18 years old at the time, she told me. And I asked her, what is the significance of her being back in Washington, D.C. in this moment? And I want to play a little bit of our conversation.
It's just outright sabotage on the core value of our democracy, the right to vote. And my father used to say about the presidency, he said, it's not doing the right thing. It's hard for me. I've got the courage. I've got the fortitude. I've got the will. But too often it's knowing what the right thing to do is. And in this case, there's just no alternative for me. The only right thing for me to be was to be here.
And poignant words there as this Friday marks the 56th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. Allison?
All right. Priscilla Thompson in D.C., thank you so much.
You bet.
The GOP making a mockery of the latest mask guidance, and it's all about the ballot box in 2022. NBC News senior national politics reporter Jonathan Allen saying Republicans are betting that voters will blame Democrats for any ongoing suggestion that they protect themselves and others from the coronavirus. John joins me live now. So, John, Republican Congressman Mary Miller slammed the mask rules in the House last week, saying the Democrats are using fear and mandates to continue the crisis mode. You write that Miller's charge is a useful distillation of the way in which Republican officials are communicating with voters during the recent resurgence, and it foreshadows a campaign season in which the GOP runs on freedom from the disease while modeling behavior that promotes its spread. Let's talk about what other kind of messaging you're expecting from the Republicans heading into 2022 here.
I mean, look, we're going to hear a lot of things from Republicans. If there's inflation, we'll hear about inflation. We're going to hear certainly about the vaccines and the frustration with vaccines, and certainly the Trump base that has had sort of mixed messaging on vaccines. I mean, Trump says he supports vaccines, but he's not out there actively promoting them. But, you know, I think that the bigger sort of question for Republicans when they talk to their base is always, what kind of freedoms are you being asked to give up? And in this case, the question is, are you willing to give up your freedom to not wear a mask in order to protect yourself and other people from dying?
John, let's talk about Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis, one of the loudest Republican voices on this topic and also a potential 2024 contender, is getting crushed with COVID cases right now, but he is doubling down on keeping everything open. Here's what he said this morning.
We're not shutting down. We're going to have schools open. We're protecting every Floridian's job in this state. We're protecting people's small businesses. These interventions have failed time and time again throughout this pandemic, not just in the United States, but abroad. They have not stopped the spread.
So, John, how could this bet backfire on DeSantis as Florida continues to break new COVID records?
Well, he just said that they're going to protect every Floridian's job. Your job is not protected if you're an employed person who dies from a COVID infection. So, you know, it'd be pretty easy to start counting up the jobs that weren't saved by his decision. I think that there was a period last year when President Trump was really wrestling with the question of how much damage the economy could sustain while having social distancing. And what we've seen from this is a number of Republican governors, including DeSantis and certainly Trump at times last year, basically making the decision that the fatalities from this disease are less than the damage of an economic slowdown. Now, that doesn't mean it's an either or. We've certainly seen that many businesses can function with some basic safety rules in place and cut down on the spread of disease. And of course, if everybody would get vaccinated, at least the variants we've seen so far, there's a tremendous protection either from getting COVID in the first place or in the case of the Delta variant and the breakthroughs, tremendous protection from actually severe disease as a result of that.
So, John, we got to look at the other side of this, the Democrats. DNC Chair Jamie Harrison telling NBC News he thinks the Dems will be rewarded for how they've handled the pandemic. But you've said it and you wrote it. This virus is still spreading and it's still killing people. So how much of a victory can the Democrats claim here?
I think this is going to be one of the big political questions going into next year. I mean, it should be a policy question, but it wasn't last year. And we saw, I think the reason Democrats are confident is they think that voters rewarded them for the way they behaved last year during the pandemic. As compared to President Trump. But there's no guarantee that that'll be the case going into 2022 if the disease is still spreading.
All right, John Allen, always great to see you. Thanks so much.
You too, Allison.
Tomorrow is the first anniversary of the massive explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. The blast at the port killed hundreds of people and destroyed much of the city. A new report from Human Rights Watch says top Lebanese officials knew about the warning signs but did nothing. NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter has more from Beirut.
Hey, Allison, that's right. So in the last year since the explosion, there has been no investigation, no accountability. And for the thousands of victims of that blast, there has been no justice. Now, Human Rights Watch has taken on the task of putting out a huge report. They have gone through documents and years of evidence to prove that senior Lebanese officials knew that tons of ammonium nitrate was being unsafely stored at the Beirut port, and they then failed to safeguard the population. A couple key points. Take a look. HRW finds evidence that senior Lebanese officials were criminally negligent, and the report, and this is key, calls on the UN Human Rights Council to mandate an investigation and calls on other countries to issue sanctions against senior officials. Now, the report also writes, Allison, under international human rights law, a state's failure to act to prevent foreseeable risks to life violates the right to life. And now the push for justice, not just coming from organizations like UNICEF, which was also out with a big report today, or HRW, but from the families of the victims. They are leading the charge here. Now, everyone in Lebanon, as far as we can tell, is pretty angry. We spoke with a couple of people in the last couple of days about how they're feeling about the anniversary and what they want to see done. Take a listen.
It's very frustrating. It's sad to say that it's expected because we've been accustomed to not getting any justice done in this country. But again, what happened is so big that I think this time people will have a hard time letting it pass without seeing actual justice.
We really urge the international community to do something, some kind of sanctions, tough sanctions on these politicians so that they can feel the heat, because until today, they're living large, they're living free.
Now, Allison, all of this is taking place against a very dark backdrop. As you can see, most Lebanese right now just have a couple of hours of electricity every day. But the country is in the biggest financial crisis it has seen in decades. The currency is in free fall. It's lost more than 90% of its valuation. Half the country lives below the poverty line, and 3/4 of the country, Allison, can't afford to put food on the table. So there will be huge marches tomorrow on the anniversary of that blast. We will be out there, but people are going to be angry about a lot of things.
A new Senate intelligence report warning federal agencies are severely unprepared for foreign cyber attacks. The largest federal agency scoring an average grade of C-. NBC News correspondent Ken Delaney reports on the lack of federal protection to safeguard America's data.
Allison, this is yet more evidence that the United States is failing to take basic steps that could make it harder for hackers to penetrate our computer networks. It's true across the private sector, and this report by the Senate Homeland Security Committee makes clear it remains true for the federal government despite years of warnings and damaging breaches. 6 years ago, we learned that Chinese intelligence officers had stolen most of the federal personnel files from an agency using outdated computer systems. This report shows how little has changed. The Senate committee reviewed the annual cyber audit findings from the internal watchdogs of 8 federal agencies: the Department of Homeland Security, State, Transportation, Education, Housing and Urban Development, Agriculture, and Health and Human Services, along with the Social Security Administration. Now, the Housing, Agriculture, and Health departments got letter grades of C for cybersecurity, while the Departments of State, Transportation and Education, and the Social Security Administration got Ds. One major issue is that many agencies still operate unsupported legacy computer systems that are extremely vulnerable to hackers. The State Department's email system, Allison, was breached by Russian hackers back in 2014. So the fact that they still get a D tells you everything you need to know. Now, the report's main recommendation is for a centrally coordinated approach to government-wide cybersecurity. The senators say a single office should develop and implement cybersecurity strategy for the federal government. Look, nobody's saying this is an easy issue, Allison. It's difficult to impose uniform standards across a sprawling federal bureaucracy with computer systems that go back decades. But it's going to require a big push by the White House, and I have yet to see that kind of focus from any president, Democrat or Republican.
Major companies like Walmart and Facebook ramping up their return to work requirements. So will more businesses jump on board and make COVID shots or testing mandatory? NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Rule takes a look.
After the rush to get vaccinated, the number of shots going into arms plateaued in July. And now all eyes on businesses, which experts say could help sway tens of millions of unvaccinated Americans that are eligible for a shot but still on the fence.
The differences between businesses acting and not acting right now is millions and millions of people. And I would dare say probably an end to this curve we're on with Delta.
The list of companies with some sort of requirement is growing. Facebook and New York's MTA among the latest, making them mandatory for employees or requiring regular testing. Equinox and Broadway theaters will also require both workers and patrons get a shot. Walmart, America's biggest employer, is also requiring them, but only for corporate employees, a fraction of its nearly 1.6 million person workforce. That means frontline workers are exempt from the mandate. Uber has a similar policy. Office workers will be required. Rideshare drivers will not.
The most important thing that can happen now would be the business community stepping forward and saying, if you're going to be in our place of business, you're going to be vaccinated or have a good reason not to and show a negative test.
But for many businesses, the FDA's full approval is key.
They're going to say, once we get full authorization for the use of this vaccine, you're going to do it or you won't be able to work here.
A green light many are waiting for as cases grow by the day.